You have some virtual solutions too.
I don't know. The answer is fundraising
Okay.
It's in there. It's just right topic. I just looked at it.
I think from this end we're okay.
Since the screen is, are you still sharing the screen?
Okay.
Yeah, the screen share is still running, so it's all good. Yeah, so we're good.
Good. Okay.
So once this presenter is done, you just close it. Just close it. Close it. You open the next presentation. Depending on the sort of presentation it is. And you just go, if it is a PowerPoint presentation, you use slideshow. If it is a PDF, you just use full screen.
Yeah, can you go to that one? I think we should get started.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Okay, I think we should get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second part of the climate variability and predictability session. We have 6 presentations here. Our first speaker is Matthew from University of Victoria. He will talk about the simulated extreme heat events. So Matthew, please. This is a pointer.
Okay, and then that's the slides.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I believe your slides are on here.
Yeah, it's there.
Yes. Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Matthew. I'm going to be talking on extreme heat event GV analysis in the Pacific Northwest. This is some work I've been doing for my PhD. It started in trying out to understand how heat wave like variability is changing with climate change, and it turned into a more in-depth investigation of generalized extreme value distributions. So really to get us started, I wanted to talk about what GVs are used for. So heat waves and especially extreme events are by definition very rare. So we have limited amount of samples that we can use. And the generalized extreme value distribution, or GV, is used as a tool to basically extrapolate the relatively short observation period. And for example, make a statement about, for example, something, a heat wave of 1 in a 100-year event. It's also used to understand how climate change is affecting the frequency of extreme events, primarily through these event attribution studies. And so this plot here I'm showing is from Philip et al. 2022, which was one of these first studies looking at the Pacific Northwest 2021 heat wave, which initially estimated that to be a 1 in a 1,000-year event, which compared to the 75-year historical record is quite the statement, and also 150 times more likely due to climate change. And so to understand how we can put so much trust in this distribution, I wanted to first cover where it comes from. And so this is a very simplified explanation. Let's say we have an initial distribution. We can know it. It might be unknown. And we do the following experiment. We take a bunch of samples from this distribution, and we put them in a series of bags. In each of those bags, we'll put n samples. And the size of each bag is called the block size. And from each of the bags, we take just one value, the maximum value. And according to the extreme value theorem, the distribution of these maximum points, so the blue points, will or can only be the generalized extreme value distribution. So this doesn't come from physics. It's a mathematical derivation. And it is an extremely powerful one because the initial distribution doesn't really matter as long as the tail is monotonically decreasing. And you have a large enough block, the distribution will tend towards a GV. And so when we're trying to fit this data, what we're really looking for is 3 parameters. We have the location parameter, which basically shifts our distributions to left and right on the x-axis. We have a scale parameter that controls the width of the central peak, and then a shape parameter, chi, which controls the tail behavior. And just as an important note, we have strong evidence to believe that the GV that fits heat waves is a generalized extreme value distribution with a negative shape parameter, and so it has a maximum absolute temperature above which probability goes to 0. Okay, so this also comes from the fact that there's a lot of negative feedbacks for very strong heat waves, so we expect there to be an absolute maximum temperature. So that's a very robust and neat little theory. There have been some papers already looking at how well this actually works in practice, primarily looking at heat waves and really motivated by the Pacific Northwest heat wave in particular. So Zeter et al. 2023, for example, shows that using a sample size that's smaller than the target return period that we're trying to estimate can result in an overestimate of the return period. This is a very strong statement. It's a very interesting paper. Also on the effect of the block size, so I didn't quite mention this. When we're doing this analysis, usually we're using an annual block size. So we have inside each block 365 days of the year. And we're taking the absolute maximum of that. So really we're sampling from about 90 days, which is the summer days. And we're assuming that those 90 days are enough to reach this generalized extreme value distribution. There's been a few studies that have shown that that might not be sufficient. And we've also looked at this. And then finally, there's the question we set out to look at, which is whether climate change is changing the initial distribution over time. And so we're not really sampling from the same distribution, so we don't really expect a stable GV. And that would show up in the shape and scale parameters changing over time. And so these two questions are what we're going to be looking at, non-stationarity from climate change and the annual block size. I will be using this area of study. It was the first used for Bartosek 2022 to study the Pacific Northwest heat wave. I'll be looking at KENI-SM5, the Max Planck large ensemble, and MIROC 6 large ensemble as well. And I will be taking the spatial average of the maximum daily temperature over this area before doing any of my analysis. And I'm using a Markov chain Monte Carlo Bayesian inference for fitting my generalized extreme value distributions and obtaining my uncertainty ranges. So getting to the first question, how is climate change affecting the generalized extreme value distribution? Specifically looking at KENI-SM. So we already know that the location parameter will for sure change with the increase in global mean surface temperature. And so to get that out of the way, what we're doing first is subtracting the climatological average. We have large ensemble, so we do this by just subtracting the yearly ensemble mean of maximum temperature. And we obtain something that we might call a stationary data. It's not evolving with climate change, or at least that's what we want to test. We want to test if the shape and scale parameters are evolving or not. And so to do this, we are going to subdivide our time series into 10-year bins and fit a generalized extreme value distribution to each of those 10-year bins. And I'm doing this for the historical period, shown in green, and then for the 5 different SSP projections, from colors blue to red. And this is the scale and shape parameters as a function of the maximum temperature anomaly with respect to the historical baseline. And so what we see, at least for KENI-SM5, is that the scale parameter is not changing significantly with increasing temperature, and with a p-value of 0.47, so it's not very robust, or it doesn't refute the null hypothesis, but it is very consistent with the null hypothesis. And similarly here for the shape parameter. And so what this means, or the hypothesis is that if these parameters are not changing with climate change, then the atmospheric dynamics that cause heat waves are also kind of staying the same, and everything is just being shifted to a higher temperature range. if we go and look at the other two models, so in the middle, the left is KENI-SM5. That's the same thing we just saw before. The middle one is MIROC-6. And here we see that the shape parameter is decreasing with climate change, and MPI is showing an increase with climate change. So the models disagree. Yes, that's it. There's not a whole lot I can do about that. Just for a little bit of context, though, not all models perform the same. So this is a study by DeLuca et al. 2020 that quantified the skill of these different of the CMIP models in predicting maximum temperatures. And KENI-SM5 and MIROC-6 are somewhat worse than average, and MPI is one of the better performing models at predicting maximum temperatures. Again, this warranting further investigation of why those scale parameters are changing in some models and not in others, and what's going on with the dynamics there. For the second question, the idea that the one-year block size that the Philip et al. 2022 study used to estimate the return period for the Pacific Northwest heat wave, we want to investigate whether this one-year block size is sufficient. And so to do that, we're now pooling all of the data from KENI-SM5 into a single analysis. This includes the 5 SSP projections and the historical data, and we're fitting a single curve to that. And that's this blue line. And as you can see, the high return period values, this tail end of the distribution, which is really what we're interested in for these high magnitude events, is not well fit by the GB distribution. And so one thing we've done here is to look at increasing the block size. This is a block size of 10 years, now shown by the orange curve. We see that, of course, the uncertainty increases because we're decreasing the number of points, but it's a better fit to the overall data. And in the plot on the subplot here, this is showing the log of the ratio between the curve and the data. So a value of 0 is perfect fit. And we see that even in the lower magnitude events, the higher block size is a better fit. So indicating that increasing block size is leading to better convergence to generalized extreme value distribution, as we would have expected. And so we can do this, take it one step further. When does it converge? So if we keep increasing block size, when does the shape parameter stabilize? And so that's the plot we're showing here on the right-hand side. And we see that potentially up to a block length of 20 years, we can see the shape parameter evolving, which means that it's not fully converged to generalized extreme value distribution, at least in KENI-SM5, until you use block length of 20. And then beyond that, it gets quite noisy, so it's maybe not even fully certain to say that it's stabilized there. And so this brings me to my conclusion slide. Basically, to recap, the non-stationarity from climate change is model dependent, requiring further investigation. KENI-SM5 shows no change or is consistent with no change. And then MIROC and MPI have opposing trends for scale parameter. And then on the effect of the block size, we see that the yearly block size is not well fit past the 1 in 200 year event, requiring multi-year block periods, potentially up to 20 years for KENI-SM5. And that's everything.
So, any questions on the study? I have one quick question. Do you have any reason, why you're including the oceanic grid in your domain of interest? Why not exclude?
Yeah, that's a good question. For ease of use was the main reason. And then this is the area that Bartosek 2022 used as well, consistent with the synoptic scale of the event. So it just kept the water as well.
Curious. Go ahead.
My question is regarding the trends in the scale and shape parameters. In one of the models, we see that there is a kind of one increases and the MPI, I think, one increases and the other increases. Both will modify the extremes, maybe in a way that they compensate each other and they give something as the mechanism. Is that?
That's a good point. Yeah, so a more negative shape parameter means the GV is truncating sharper, and then an increase in the scale parameter broadens that. Yeah, so that's a good point. The absolute maximum might be the same, might be increasing by the same amount. Yes.
Okay, thanks again.
Good. Thank you very much.
Let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ray Garnett from Agri-Climatic Consulting. We're talking about interesting climate CO2 debate. Oh, yeah. So this is a pointer, and then forward.
Oh,
Backward.
why is the presentation? Why is it like
Second. The first one. Yeah. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. I've worked with Dr. Kanagar for many, many years, and we published a paper on this subject. Anybody's interested, just came out 2025, and so forth. Anyway, we'll move ahead here. The rationale for this paper, there's debate about carbon dioxide emissions, and by 2050 that we're going to have to go to net 50, this sort of a thing, and they call it. And we rarely hear about the beneficial effects of carbon dioxide. And so in this talk, we're going to be emphasizing the beneficial ways in which it helps grains grow and so forth. And we assert that carbon dioxide is beneficial, and the crucial role in CO2 is noted in photosynthesis. So I'll be talking mainly about the beneficial effects of carbon dioxide on plants. This is just a curve showing the increase in carbon dioxide emissions. I worked for the Canadian Wheat Board for many, many years. And so it's a global shop they had. And Russian wheat yields, believe it or not, are increasing faster than anybody else. They're the largest exporter of wheat, and their yields are doing very, very well. And what I'm showing here is just the increase in carbon dioxide emissions on the left, and these are the Russian all wheat yields. And so I simply did a correlation and said, well, it's 0.91. Now there's more yields than carbon dioxide, of course. I'll show you that later. The bottom slide shows the variation, the trending of the yields. And they had some really rough droughts, as you can see. 2012 was a serious one. So weather is still a major driver in dryland areas when it comes to yields. And that's just the first example of it. This is the next one, increase in spring wheat and canola yield for that period of time, 1995, 2004. You can see the spring wheat yields, just simply doing the correlation, R of 8.5, canola 0.81. And you can see the serious drought in 2021 that this lad was talking about here earlier. And so we know what caused that. We're quite sure. We had La Nina conditions, December through March, and we had high solar activity. And solar activity has an aggravating role when it comes to as a forcing function. If it works with La Nina, if you got both those, that kind of increases the risk of drought. And so 15% of increase for 15% increase in CO2, increase in yields 89%, that sort of a thing. But the other thing I want to mention here is weather might be the most dominant factor, but increased CO2 is probably another. Fertilizer usage we have to concede is important. Improved varieties and better pesticides. So there's a number of factors that drive yields, and we submit that CO2 is certainly one of them. And so that's really all I want to say on that one. This is looking at that drought period of 21 to 23. This is a composite diagram. And the blue line there is the 5 wettest years for a period of time. And the red line is the driest years over the Canadian prairies. I think it's for June and July. It's looking at Nino 334 sea surface temperatures. The black line is simply operational research against that composite. And you'll see in all these graphs that we had La Nina conditions running December into about March or so. And the other data over here just shows you how dry it was in June and July in 2021. It's only 50% of normal precip over the prairies. And, you know, that's the key period for wheat, spring wheat and canola. We can see on the next one, 22, they had a lot of heat in July. If I can get this thing to work, but anyway, you can see it, I think. I think you can see it. July, you can see it was very hot in 2022, 19.5. And so we're just trying to explain, looking at the climatology of that year, and probably the main driver of why we were dry as we were. But these were the triple dip, we call it the triple dip La Nina of 21 to 23, and so forth. So we'll move on to the next one. This is looking at U.S. hard red winter yields. You'll see the slope is not very steep. We find a correlation, but it's not as strong as certainly the Russian one. And if you look at this, the second graph, this detrended yields shows the variation that weather causes. And the drought, 22, we had a serious drought. And we also had high solar activity. But El Nino is the friend, La Nina is the foe when it comes to the Canadian prairies, for sure. And that's been identified decades ago. And so I work as a consultant. I write for mainly grain growers on the prairies. And this is just looking at the corn yields, a huge crop, biggest crop in the world, and very important for prices. It shows, again, an upward slope, R value of 0.85. And you can see the variation in yield. We had a serious drought there in 2012. And again, we see that La Nina, we had La Nina conditions December through March, 115 sunspots. Usually 60 is about average for solar activity. So those two factors combined, again, to affect not only the, so that it affects the U.S. as well, this business of El Nino and La Nina. And I've only got 12 minutes, so I have to move. This is the increase in yields in Australia. And with the increasing CO2, correlation is not as strong. And this shows the variation in here. What in Australia, they don't like El Nino at all. It's our friend, and La Nina is their friend, but not that we're climatically twinned. I've said that decades ago, and it's true. I've proven it with correlation analysis. And so I think I've made my point, and we'll move on to the next slide. This is work that was done in the forestry. Higher CO2 concentrations increase plant growth. This shows a net change over a period of time. The greening, this is from Patrick Moore. And here's another study done by ENSO on pine trees. As you increase the carbon dioxide emissions, you get better growth from pine trees. And this is another example, the increase in crop biomass for additional CO2. If you look at rapeseed there's something like 47% in the middle. So it's again suggesting that CO2 is important for the growth of rapeseed or canola. I think, okay. This is just looking at crops generally. Research shows that increased CO2 helps plants resist drought, intense heat, pollution, and other environmental stresses. Here's your rice. You can see the increase in 61 in soybeans and wheat. So it's just more proof, I think, that carbon dioxide is important to crops. Here's another one. This is looking at carbon dioxide emissions versus world food production. This is from Gokliani. There's your increase in parts per million of CO2, and there's your production growth, and it's mainly yield. Yield is what drives production for the most part. Okay, and this is just a slide that came from a certain paper by Richard Lindzen and Haffer. It just says that less additional CO2 causes smaller and smaller radiative forcing. And so the more you accumulate it, it just doesn't, there's a sort of a saturation point where it affects radiation forcing. More CO2 will not be harmful to humanity by way of increased global warming or more weather extremes. And it's our assessment that weather extremes, you can't really be linked to increasing CO2. We just don't buy it, and there's other publications that say that as well. This is going back, looking at geological time and CO2 increases and so forth. You'll see that plant life starves about 150 parts per million. I'd still like to know how you get that darn thing. But anyway, you can see that 150 parts per million and plants starve. So when you hear people talking about net zero by 2050, you say, well, you get net zero, what happens? We have no plant growth. We got no photosynthesis. And so it's kind of scary, in my opinion. And so the answer is, why didn't the world burn up way back geological time when it was 20 times higher, more constant CO2? And so the other thing that's coming out is the expense of going to net zero by 250 to maintain a temperature of below 1.5% increase. And people want, a lot of them want to keep CO2 at a certain level, according to the Paris Treaty or whatever. But there's a Swiss insurance company that's come out and basically said that net zero agenda would cost the world economy something like $240 trillion. It's expensive. And the net zero for the Canadian prairies, or for Canada, the government made an estimate in 2022, projected to cost about $3 to $5 trillion Canadian, or 125 to 140 million per annum, to get to net zero by 2050. So that would cost a $2 trillion, would amount to about every Canadian resident spending about $5,000 a year. I don't know, do we want to spend $5,000 each on this question? I don't think so. And there's various other costs that they have there too, in terms of, we'd have to have net zero building codes, all kinds of regulations to try to get to this aspect of net zero. And that's in our 2025 paper. And also Friends of Science, based in Calgary. This is where this information comes from. And summary, I'm just saying, one increases in grain yield per 1% increase in CO2, about 9.5 for Russian, about 5, or this in terms of percent. Spring wheat, you can see for yourself that it's aids, seems to aid. That does aid corn yield, or crop yields. And these are the largest exporters in the world, number 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so forth. And I might add that France has a severe drought this year, severe, and it could affect world wheat production. So we conclude that emission levels of CO2 be allowed to rise steadily in the next 25 years to reach 500 parts per million. Reducing CO2 emissions would involve enormous costs. A future warmer climate would be more beneficial to the world by way of more gains and less human fatalities. Colder weather is what really kills human beings more than warm. And most of the data that I work with and others suggest the Earth is going to cool. We're in it's called the Eddy solar minimum, cycle 25, solar cycle. And so I maintain that solar activity is far more important than carbon dioxide emissions in terms of global temperatures. And that's about it. Oh, I'm going to move a couple more here. Let's embrace carbon dioxide. It is the staff of life. How about that? And then the next is just my references. Anybody wants to read these publications, there you are. All right. Thank you. All right.
you. So any questions on
And this is a book that Dr. Kanagar, who I've worked with for decades, is called About Face, Why the World Needs More Carbon Dioxide, 2012. And this is our publication we did just this year on what I've essentially presented. And it's in this publication right here. If anybody's interested, I've got copies. Thank you for your time.
I have one naive question.
Sir, go
Okay,
ahead.
it seems that time series, when you show the strongest upward of the year trend, happen to to be with this global warming hiatus period. So it may be interesting to expand your time if possible, time series to look at the.
Yeah.
Because from we know that from 1998 to 2012 or some those years it's like a global warming, it's a very slow.
Hiatus.
But hiatus. But your yield trend, upward trend happened to be strongest over those periods. So I don't know whether that's.
Well, it's a 30-year period. You know, that seems to be the way to look at it. Anybody else out there?
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
Let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Rugu He from McGill University, talking about stratospheric water vapor impact on surface warming. How do I use the laser pointer? It's this here. Forward, backward, and pointer is this. Okay, thank you. This one.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Ruogu He, PhD student from McGill University, supervised by Professor Yi Huang. So today I would like to share with you a full column view of the radiative adjustment of stratospheric water vapor. So first of all, why do we care about the stratospheric water vapor, the SWV? It's because it's a highly variable greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So from the long-term observation, the global mean SWV has decreased about 0.5 ppmv from 1995 to 2010. And this is already 10% of the background value. A more intriguing case is the Honga Tonga eruption, during which about 40 ppm water vapor was injected into the stratosphere. That's far more than 100% of the background value. However, our understanding about the climate impact of such SWV change, in other words, the strength of the SWV feedback, has long been debated. So as shown in this histogram, this is the SWV field parameter quantified in different literatures. So we have measurements high as 0.3 watt per square meter per K. That's about 30% of the overall climate feedback. We have measurements about 0.17 watt per square meter per K. That's comparable to the cloud and aerial feedback. At the same time, we also have measurements as low as 0.02 watt per square meter per K. So that's making the SWV an insignificant contributor to the global warming. So it seems that we have large disagreement on the strength of the SWV feedback, but now we know that this is due to the compensation of the radiative effect of the associated atmospheric temperature change. As shown in this plot, this is the atmospheric temperature response to the SWV perturbation. We can see that after adding SWV, we have stratospheric cooling. So reducing the Planck emission, reducing the outgoing long-wave radiation. This is a positive contribution to the SWV feedback. But at the same time, we also have the tropospheric warming, increasing the outgoing long-wave radiation. So this is a negative contribution to the SWV feedback. So we find a radiative compensation between those two atmospheric layers that could modify the SWV feedback strength. However, there's a gap in the current studies. So either people use multimodal assessment to quantify the SWV feedback strength, but only accounting for the stratospheric temperature adjustment, or people use full column temperature adjustment, but only using 1 GCM. So there's a gap between them. We need a multimodal assessment with the full column temperature adjustment, and that's what we attempt to fill in. The scientific question behind is, first, we want to examine the robustness of the temperature adjustment pattern and the associated radiative compensation, as we find in previous slides. And also, we want to know the uncertainty, in other words, the intermodal spread of the SWV feedback. So to answer those two questions, we select 12 GCMs from CMOS 6. We use the air temperature, the water vapor, albedo, and cloud to represent their climatology. We use the SWV response to 4 times CO2 as the perturbation. And we put all the information into a radiative transfer model, the RTMG, to simulate the radiatively driven temperature adjustment and the associated TOA forcing and the feedback. This is done by applying the fixed dynamic heating assumption. So during the model integration, the dynamic heating rate is fixed, so that the temperature adjustment, the atmospheric temperature adjustment, is purely driven by the radiative heating rate. So we integrate the temperature change until the atmospheric heating rate profile restores to the unperturbed level, and then we calculate TOD flux and the associated feedback. So next, I will move on to the result part. First, I would like to show the SWV response to 4 times CO2 in the CMOS 6, as shown in this plot. So we have 12 models, and the vertical layer is from 1 hectopascal to 250 hectopascal. The red color means moistening, and the blue color means drying. We can see that under the same forcing scenario, the 4 times CO2, the SW response simulated by different GCM is very different. Some models project a strong moistening across all the stratosphere, but some models even have drying in the upper atmosphere. So one would expect that the temperature adjustment driven by those very different SW perturbations should also be very different. And that's partly right. So here is the temperature adjustment induced by different SW perturbations. We can see that, yes, the magnitude of the temperature adjustments are very different in different models, ranging from 1 Kelvin to 10 Kelvin. But the pattern of the temperature adjustment is robust across all the models. We always have a cooling stratosphere and a warming troposphere centered in the mid-latitude low UTLS region. This indicates a radiative compensation between those two atmospheric layers. So the next step is to calculate the associated forcing. We divide the total forcing into 3 different components. The first one is the instantaneous radiative forcing, so the radiative absorption and emission by the SWV. The second part is the forcing induced by the stratospheric cooling. We term it the stratospheric adjustment. And the third part is the forcing induced by the tropospheric warming. We term it the tropospheric adjustment. As shown in this plot here, the panel A, in the panel A, the x-axis is the average SW perturbation. The y-axis is the instantaneous radiative forcing. So we see that the larger perturbation we have, the stronger instantaneous forcing we have. And that's the same story for the stratospheric adjustment as shown in panel B. So the more perturbation we have, the stronger stratospheric cooling we have, so the larger forcing we have. However, at the same time, we also have a stronger tropospheric warming. So this would lead to a more negative forcing as shown in panel C here. And we can also observe a strong correlation between the SW perturbation and the forcing components. So if we summarize the result from this plot, every 1 ppmv SWV would give you 0.08 watt per square meter instantaneous forcing plus 0.23 watt per square meter from the stratospheric cooling, but largely offset by 0.29 watt per square meter from the tropospheric warming. So the overall SWV forcing is reduced to 0.02 watt per square meter per ppmv. Next, to better illustrate the compensation between those two atmospheric components, we plot the stratospheric adjustment against the tropospheric adjustment in different simulations. And the blue line here is the 1, 2, -1 reference line. So we can see that even though the SW perturbation is very different, the magnitude of the temperature adjustments are very different, But the compensation is very similar. All the points are falling close to this 1, 2 minus y reference line. Actually, if we calculate the compensation ratio, define it as the absolute value of the stratospheric adjustment over the tropospheric adjustment, as I'm listing in this table here, you can see that all the compensation ratio in different experiments is very close to 0.8. So this means that on the LTOA, the system can only feel about 20% of the radiative effect of the temperature adjustments. So this is evidence that validates the robustness of the radiative compensation of the temperature adjustments. So lastly, let's go back to the SWV feedback. We calculate the SWV feedback using different forcing components, and due to time limit, I will just summarize the result of this plot in this table here. So if we calculate the SWV feedback with instantaneous radiative forcing, then the multimodal mean feedback is 0.06 watt per square meter per K. This is enhanced by the stratospheric cooling to 0.25 watt per square meter per K. But after taking into account the tropospheric warming, the overall SWV feedback is reduced to 0.02 watt per square meter per K. So we find that the SWV feedback is muted by the temperature adjustment. So this leads me to the concluding slide. So we find that the SWV induced tropospheric warming and the stratospheric cooling is a robust feature. And the radiative compensation of these two atmospheric layers is also robust, leading to a muted overall SWV feedback to be 0.02 watt per square meter per K. So that's all I will share with you, and thank you for attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions on I have one quick question. Like in your slide, I think slide 8, you show the total is a 0.02.
Yes.
What's the uncertainty? Like if you calculate individual model?
Oh yeah. We didn't calculate the uncertainty of this number here, but we didn't show it here. But the uncertainty is about 0.007 watt per square meter per ppmv. Yes. Thank you. Okay, thank you again for your attention.
Let's move on to our next speaker. It's Alejandro Luca from University of Quebec at Montreal. And they will talk about the future changes of internal climate variability.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm presenting on behalf of one of my students, whose name is Leandre Udelebrec, and the main supervisor is Martin Leduc, who is from Uranus, and this work was also done in collaboration with other people, Robert Way and Émilie Bresson. So the title is Quantifying the Future Evolution of Internal Climate Variability for Northern Quebec and Labrador. And I start by showing you this figure that shows annual mean temperature values somewhere in the Labrador, so north of Quebec, since 1880 to 2020. And what we see is, in fact, quite a large variability of the temperature in this region. And we also see some of the forcings that led to that variability, so low frequency variability associated with the Nino and other low frequency phenomena, but also some volcanoes and other natural forcings. For example, here we see the Krakatoa eruption, and there is one other somewhere there. And basically what this evolution of temperature shows is that there are a few different things influencing the temperature here. On one side, we have an anthropogenic climate change. So basically, the change in greenhouse gases and aerosols led to some long-term trend that is hidden somewhere in that evolution. And at the same time, superimposed to that trend, there is
different natural forcings and the internal variability of the climate system due to some nonlinear interaction in the system. So if we want to try to understand how this might change in the future in terms of the long-term trend, but also the variability, the question is, how do we do that? Because there is a lot of variability, and if we use a single model simulation, for example, might be really hard to separate the long-term trend from the variability. And what we do is that we use a single model initial condition, large ensembles that were also presented before. And here I show some temperature curves with the Canadian ESM large ensemble. And in gray, we see 50-member temperature evolution since 1950 to 2060. And we see in red one single member, and we see how variable one single member might look like. And we also see the black curve, which is the average of all those members that allows us to have a relatively robust estimation of the long-term trend. And we also see the distribution of all the members, and the main focus of this presentation is trying to understand whether the shape or the distribution it will change in the future. So the objectives are to characterize future climate change in these northern regions, northern Quebec, quantify changes in interannual climate variability during winter and spring, and we will see that to understand well the temperature changes, we need to understand to some extent snow cover and sea ice changes in these regions. And again, to do that, we have this Canadian ESM large ensemble that we will use to, in fact, to drive our 50 members. We will use them to drive the Canadian Regional Climate Model, the version 5, over this domain here, which is the Northeast North America. And so we will downscale to 12 kilometers using each of these members here. We will have 50-member large ensemble with the regional model that allows us to have a better representation of some surface processes in this region. And so a few more details on the model, but I think this is the area we are looking at. So this is the focus is mainly on northern Quebec, and the data is available if you are interested in it. So let's start by showing some changes in the mean temperature between a future period, 20-year period, 2080, 2099, and the present period from 2000 to 2019. And we see the mean climate change for different months from December to May. And what we see is a clear warming over all the region, with also a clear north-south gradient, and where larger increases are seen in the northern part of the domain. And we also see that this gradient, north-south gradient, is stronger during the winter months, January, February, and March. If we look at how the variability of the temperature will change between the future, or the present and the future, what we see is, in fact, a decrease mostly over all the region. The largest decreases occur, again, in high latitudes. And this is, in fact, we will look at a little more in detail in the following slides. The other interesting thing we see, there are some changes that are not statistically significant, but what we see is also in May that in the northern part of Quebec, some regions, in fact, might experience increases in the interannual temperature variability. And so let's look at a little bit deeper at what's going on in February. And again, in February, we see a decrease everywhere, with higher values in the northern latitudes, but also particularly focused over the ocean. And in fact, what I show here is the change for the present and the gradient for the present and the future. And basically what this is showing is that because we have much stronger warming on the northern part of the domain, we have the north-south gradient that decreases in the future. And so the variability that is mostly associated with Rossby waves going through and basically advection of temperature decreases because this temperature gradient is slower. So we have, in general, lower variability everywhere in winter, and this is exacerbated over the oceans because there is a general decrease of sea ice cover in the Hudson Bay. For example, in the present, we have mostly cover for February in all members, but in the future, we have much lower fraction of sea ice cover. And so basically, now we expose the air temperature to water, which is much more stable, and then the variability of the temperature associated with that also decreases. So the decrease is much stronger over regions where the sea ice cover decreases. The other interesting month is what's happened in May. In May, what we have is general decrease, but mostly increases in the very northern part of the domain. And to explain that, in fact, we need to look at what's going on with the snow cover in this case. And this is, as you see, in fact, these increases are observed over land grid points. And these increases, in fact, are related with how the snow cover line moves towards the north in the future. And basically, the snow cover here, we see that the brownish colors show decreases and the greenish show increases. Sorry, this is not the snow water equivalent, but it's the standard deviation of the snow water equivalent. So it's the variability of snow water equivalent in the future. So the variability decreases in these regions and increases in the north. And basically what we are seeing is that in these regions, we basically have the more and more years where there is no snow water equivalent in May. And in the future, we used to have all the time, but now sometimes we don't have anymore. And so the variability increases in the north because sometimes we do have and sometimes we don't, and decreases in the north because basically we never have anymore. And this impacts, or the snow water equivalent impacts the temperature to lead to increases of temperature variability in these specific regions. So to conclude, we look at drivers of changes in winter temperature, interannual variability. There is a general weakening of the north-south temperature gradient related with the polar amplification, and that leads to a general decrease of the temperature variability overall. But there is also an important influence of how the sea ice cover changes, and that impacts also the temperature variability in winter. When we look at the spring, specifically in summer, there is also general decrease, although the polar amplification is much weaker. But also the key aspect here is to see how the snow cover and the snow water equivalent changes in the future, as it leads to some decreases in the south and increases in the north. So if you have some questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them. Thank you. Yes. So the internal variability is calculated using the 50-member ensemble, where, for example, for each year, you will have a value for those 50 members, and you will calculate the standard deviation across the members. Yes, that's how we estimate the interannual variability, based on the different members of the ensemble for each specific year.
This 50-member you use is based on KESM 2 or 5?
In fact, is the downscaled version of the CANI-SM. So we take the 50-member CANI-SM, and for each of those members, we downscale them using the CRCM5 model. And we get 50 members based on the CANI-SM members. Matthew?
I was
Yeah, to be honest, we only did look at the results based on the RCM ensemble, so we didn't compare with what we would obtain using the CAN-ESM. So, yeah, I can't really answer. CIs, the results based on CIs are based directly on the GSCM because there is no, the CRCM takes exactly the CIs as it comes from the CAN-ESM. So that it wouldn't change. But it's possibly that the representation of snow in the two models might be a little different. So I think some of these results might be different. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It seems that our next presenter not registered yet, maybe. So I don't know, like whether you want to take a quick break or you want to chat. You have any questions on the previous presentations? If there's no present, maybe we can take 15 minutes off, and then we'll be back at 11:45. Thank you. Okay, let's ask. Yeah. So is the last speaker Sai Nani here? Oh yeah. Oh, thank you very much. We just want to confirm. Yeah, thank you. No, I'm just curious.
Or impacts.
I don't know. No, that's just I have no idea.
So is this the part?
It's very interesting to see. So offset.
Yeah.
Lanes and all. And take a picture of this video. I can find some. It's very interesting. That's It is. So you are here. It's very expensive. Show. This is the
That is we like different methodology, but basically it's a consistent with the which is that basically the increases in strengths and relations and not much changes. That will, but there is a student that is reading out midways in North America and in general.
Thank you so much.
Because I think a picture of the so for keywords that are most appropriate,
Thank you so much.
in fact, I think the keyword is small. Yes, certainly there will be something in that, yes. But again, the present and the future, already the present. Without this knowing, there could be some moisture that will last dry up before in the future. So that might happen. So yes, I think it's right. Because there have been a lot of work trying to show but I for example, these certain sense that often very easy with the very recent one that is kind of do you see what I mean? Yes. Yes, and then you can also probably if it is as good as reducing, the little there is a variability of these two parameters where your fit will be nearly as good. And so often when you run distinguishing, you will get one or two. So it's really hard to well estimate. But then it's going to ask you the result about the it's a little killer for the use of the Okay. Yeah. Yeah, for example, the 1,000 years from feelings would be, I mean, there would be a lot of uncertainty about that.
It's just not cheap, but I think it's not.
Yeah, we have like,
But the way we do it is that it's one member, and you estimate your
yeah, well, it's for,
But in the first one where you have and then you have one that fell much earlier.
Yeah. Oh, consulting.
Yeah, basically what would be your error if you only had one member, which is observance, you know, maybe you yes.
Maybe they just
I didn't look at that. Okay.
这个没有别的事情。
Oh, right. Okay.
They do use the global temperatures. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're more interested in the dynamics.
Yes.
Doing a lot of stats.
Yeah, all over the place. Trying to get the idea right now. And then make sure
Okay. There were a few questions doing similar things, and my student is also doing similar things. So it's basically the temperature budget. Yeah, looking at ops first, and then like what to use. But it's also budget. I guess yeah, we need to converge to do something. Yes. Okay, okay. Yeah, and there is also a student that it's quite interesting that is working on storylines, trying to, for example, take the 2021 keyword and the idea is to think what happened worse. And there are different methods to try to make it worse. So, for example, where you basically go 8 days before the event and you reinitialize, what you remember, and some of them they need to, it's like some same, some no. So if you can get, course. And then there are large of course, it's also based on channels. You run an ensemble, you pick those that you need to and you continue until basically well, that is basically you cannot get different materials out of ensemble from events, but eventually you can do that, which is very because it's true that story
Okay, let's get back. Final speaker is Sania Nani from somewhere, talking about the multi-hazard hurricane projection. Yeah, for Atlantic.
All right, thank you.
I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine.
2 minutes.
So hello, I'm Said. I'm a PhD student at ETS Montreal, and I'm gonna talk about the project we have been conducted recently called Projected Changes in Hurricane Wind and Coastal Flood Risk in Atlantic Canada under non-stationary climate scenarios under supervision of Dr. Dusnik. So tropical cyclones account for a massive amount of human deaths and life-threatening injuries, and considering the impact of climate change, the coastal regions of Canada have always been prone to such hazards. As an example, we can bring Hurricane Fiona happened in 2022. We had maximum wind exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, along with heavy rainfalls, storm surge. And as a total, the economic damage was almost $660 million. So Atlantic Canada is increasingly vulnerable to hurricane-related wind and flooding risk. And so it's very important to assess the risk for effective preparedness, infrastructure planning, and disaster mitigation. When we are talking about tropical cyclones, we know that there are multi-hazard things. So they would have so many induced hazards by them, like wind, storm surge, flooding, rainfall, erosion, and debris. But we are just working on wind, storm surge, and flooding in this research. So risk is a product of three modules: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. The hazard describes weather events as a term of probability of occurrence, as well as physical intensity. We have vulnerability that would relate the intensity to the damage, and we have the exposure, which is everything that is exposed to that specific hazard. So there's a problem here with risk quantification. The major challenge in current risk analysis for Atlantic Canada is the reliance on wind risk as the sole proxy for overall hurricane risk. So we overlook other critical hazards such as flooding. And many models also fail to account for non-stationarity of the hurricane hazards in the changing climate. So they neglect how risk evolve over time. So what we are doing here, we're conducting a comprehensive risk assessment for both wind and flooding hazard. We address the limitation of traditional models that focus only on wind. And we incorporate non-stationarity by simulating hurricane tracks under multiple climate scenarios for current climate and for the end of the century climate. And we use these simulations to understand how risk would evolve over time. So first, we are going with the weather hazard. So we need our tracks, storm tracks. But the tracks that we are having for historical are limited. So we would have the upper tail effect. And the risk cannot be very, it cannot be quantified very well. So we are going with synthetic track approach, which is based on the generation of hundreds of thousands of storm tracks based on historical data by using statistical dynamical model. So we're getting the environmental variables from the GCMs. We're doing it for current climate and climate change. For current climate, we get from ERA 5 reanalysis database, and for climate change, we are using ECRF over SSP 5 8.5. And we are having for current climate, we have it for 1979 to 2014, and for the climate change, we divided it into two periods of 2024 to 2059 and 2060 to 2095. And then we are using a physics-based synthetic hurricane model to generate 10,000 years of TCs for historical, near future, and far future. So when it's done, we combine them with the wind speed model, and then we're coupling it with storm surge to get the flooding. For these models, we can use numerical models, although they are very accurate, but they are not efficient in risk computation, so they cannot be used. So the other option is using data-driven techniques like machine learning techniques, but they are accurate, but they are not very available for us for these regions, actually. So we're going eventually with empirical models. For data-driven techniques, we have three models for storm surge, maximum and maximum wave, also for time series wave run-up and time series storm surge. You can check out the papers here. And when we are having our probabilistic event-based simulations, we are going with vulnerability and exposure to get the risk. For risk, we are computing wind risk and coastal flooding risk. So for vulnerability, for wind risk, we are using adapted the manual vulnerability function. And for exposure, we're using Black Marble database. For coastal flooding, for vulnerability, we are using hazard step damage functions. And for exposure, we get the structures building information from OpenStreetMap. So when we are having those simulations, those tracks, those generated TC storms for historical to far future scenarios, we combine them with Holland wind model to get the maximum sustained wind speed, then with another empirical model to get the surge, and with simplified bathtub flooding model to get the maximum flooding depth. We are also using SLR projections for 2059 and 2095. Then when we are having the product, we are combining them with vulnerability and exposure to get the risk. So this is the area that we are studying. It's Atlantic Canada here. It's very vulnerable because of the geographical location of it. For wind risk, we have the resolution, which is kind of low, 10 kilometers by 8 kilometers. Then we interpolated the value to have 3 kilometers by 3 kilometers. But for flood risk assessment, we're doing high resolution. So we're having it for 5 meter by 30 meter for some specific locations in those provinces. And we are gonna interpolate them to have a 1 meter by 1 meter. So these are the data sources we're using for synthetic hurricane track generation, wind risk assessment, and coastal flooding risk assessment. And these are the generated tracks for historical, near future, and far future. And we saw that the frequency for intense storms is kind of getting higher. And we saw the change in frequency, but we also see the change in intensity that we are having intense storms for far future. And as you can see, the tracks are kind of going upward, so they would make landfall and they would make it more devastated for those regions. So here are probabilistic hazard levels for wind speed. We are doing it over various return periods from 10 to 3,000 years. So these maps are for historical. You can see that when we are going with higher return periods, we are having more intense wind speed, especially in Nova Scotia regions. We're doing it for near future and far future. You see that they are increased when we're going through far future and when we're going to higher return periods. We got the percentage change in 100-year wind speed for those future periods relative to the historical baseline. We can see that we are having more intense wind speed over those regions, especially in Nova Scotia for far future one. Again, here we see, for example, for 4 representative points in those provinces, we're getting the curves of return periods over and the intensity we're seeing when we are going from lower return periods to the higher return periods, we are having more intense wind speeds. We did it for flooding. We simulated flooding. Here you see 100-year return period flooding plots for 2 regions here, Magdalen Islands in Quebec and Halifax in Nova Scotia. We see that when we are going from historical to far future, we have more intense flooding. Also, we are seeing it for the other regions like St. John's in Newfoundland and the other one, Charlottetown in Prince Edward Island. We found out that the Halifax would have the highest flood depth. We did consider SLR. We saw that the flood depth, for example, in St. John's, has been increased by almost 27% due to sea level rise by the far future scenario. And here is showing the extent of flooding. We see that there's going to be more penetration when we are going into far future scenarios, especially when we are having SLR. This is one example for Charlottetown and Prince Edward Island. And for 5 representative points in those provinces, we see that when we are going from lower return periods to the highest return period, we are having more intensity of water depth in those regions, in those locations. We did wind risk analysis. These plots are not very good, I'm sorry, but you can see the expected damage corresponding to the return periods. When we are going through higher return periods, we are seeing more damage here, also for near future and far future. So there would be significant increase in wind hazard damage. We did it also for coastal flooding, for Magdalen Island specifically because we wanted to go high resolution, and we worked with the building information in those areas. So we got the information of buildings from OSM, so we had to go high resolution. So we went with the Magdalen Islands specifically. We got the maximum flood depth. We coupled them with the vulnerability, which are those hazard depth damage functions, and the exposure, which is the building information in that area. So then we got the risk here. For example, we see that by mid-century, the number of buildings exposed to 100-year flooding is projected to increase by 33% and 55% for the far future, or in the end of the century. We see here, for example, for far future, for the return period of 100 years of flooding, we see that more buildings are going to be damaged. And the values on those buildings are the relative damage. So we found out the frequency of the storms are going to be changed while the intensity is going to be increased. We found out the spatial patterns of change in wind and flood hazard reveal that wind hazard is very widespread, while the flood hazard is severe in low-lying areas. We found out the expected damage would be increased for both flooding and wind speed, and the wind damage is distributed more broadly because we use that exposure data that we got from black marble. But for coastal flooding damage, we found out it dominates in localized inundated zones because we had gone high resolution. So this suggests that flood risk may drive the most severe localized impacts. So this outcome illustrates the importance of hazard-specific risk model, not just going with wind risk assessment as a proxy for damage estimations. So as a conclusion, a quantitative assessment of hurricane-induced wind and coastal flood risk was carried out for Atlantic Canada under both historical and future climate scenarios. So we used the physics-based synthetic hurricane model to generate 10,000 years of tropical cyclones for different climate scenarios for current and future scenarios. And for wind risk assessment, we combined the maximum wind speed with the exposure data from black marble and adapted the manual vulnerability function to get the risk. And for flooding, we did it for, we got the maximum flood depth for those regions. We got the building level exposure data. We combined them with hazard step damage curves to get the flooding. And results highlight clear non-stationarity in hazard behavior. So the risk would be increased between mid-century to late century. And we need adaptive planning that account for both wind and flood hazards under evolving climate scenarios. So these are the acknowledgements, and thank you. Thank you.
I was wondering, did you take for the flooding in the Magdalene Island, did you take into account for the more future also the retreating coast? Because if the coast retreats.
Yeah, no, sorry, no, we didn't. Oh yeah.
Can you comment a little more about how the tracks are estimated? What variables does this model use? And
Yeah, we got specific variables from those GCMs like SSD, mean sea level pressure, and the other variables that I don't remember right now. Then we use that track model. It's based on a ODE. It solves an ODE. And then we got those intensity of the tracks, the locations. I mean, the translational speed, the intensity, the locations, the pressure, and the radius to maximum wind speed. Then we combine them with our hazard models.
no precipitation?
No.
I think I might have just missed it, but what did you consider near future and far future for your scenarios?
The near future is from 2024 to 2059. It's kind of accounting for mid-century. And the other one is from 2060 to 2095, which is accounting for late century. I guess we're done.
No more questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks again for all the speakers and also for our technical assistant. And thanks the audience for joining this session. Thank you so much. You're finished.